Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Matthew Braman. Matthew is a licensed clinical social worker and certified perinatal mental health specialist with over a decade of experience in therapy. He's the founder of Verve Psychotherapy, where he specializes in supporting men, new dads, and postpartum couples. With his combined expertise in men's mental health and perinatal psychology, he's developed what he calls mindful masculinity, an approach that helps men navigate the emotional and relational challenges of manhood and fatherhood. As a passionate advocate for men's emotional well-being, Matthew has dedicated his career to creating a therapeutic space where men can safely explore vulnerability and growth. Matthew, welcome.
Wes, I'm so happy to join you and certainly happy to join your audience. I really look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, me too. So let's start with this. Your work focuses on this concept of precarious manhood and what you call the man box of protection. Could you explain this concept and why understanding it is so crucial for men's psychological growth?
Yeah, absolutely. I recall watching a TED Talk with Tony Porter. He was a founder of an organization called A Call to Men. And that was the first time I ever heard anything about this concept called the man box. This concept of restrictive masculinity, norms, and traditional customs of what it means to be a man. And, in general, it kind of defines what a man should be. And if anyone, boy or man, is acting outside of that box, well, there's generally, a policing that goes on. And if someone's seen to be violating those norms or those, cultural, social, gender norms, then other men, especially, but also women, would police that boy or man and say, something like, don't cry, something like, be a man. And so it just kind of restricts men into these traffic lanes, basically, on how they have to navigate and operate and function in the world. And so, like I said, that TED Talk was very eye-opening for me. I came across also another documentary at some point in time called The Mask You Live In. And that's a documentary that takes a look at what it's like to be a boy or a teenage adolescent male and to be a grown adult man in this world, and how we walk around with this mask that kind of portrays this strong guy persona. And it's very much those kind of norms and rules of what it means to be a man in the man box. And so the concept with that documentary series and the mask that you live in is that underneath we all experience these human emotions. And this idea of precarious manhood is that when our man card or our gender status as a man is called into question, that can be threatening to us. And so it's like, we're wearing this mask and we're put into this man box, but the reality is that we're human and we experience something like shame, guilt, anxiety, sadness, fear, etc. And like, the rules around emotional expression, it just puts us in a really tight spot to navigate. And so when we're not living up to those norms or rules, and when we're policed, and like I said, when our gender status is called into question, well, there's a way of trying to, prove our manhood. So that precariousness, that thinly fragile mask that we wear, it oftentimes like makes men feel threatened when they're challenged as a man or as a boy. And so they end up oftentimes acting out, whether that's not seeking help, not asking for help, or causing harm to other people through like verbal or physical aggression. A lot of that sort of like unwanted or like problem behavior stuff results as a result because of the, anxiety and shame that's triggered or like caused by that questioning of one's manhood, or like calling into question whether or not they're man enough or strong enough or, good enough as a man. So in my work, finding out a bit about these concepts has been really helpful in trying to help men kind of conceptualize and better understand maybe how things like patriarchy or how things like quote, quote, like traditional masculinity norms, cultural gender norms, how they have an impact on, keeping them in that box and, making sure that they're putting on their mask every day to be, living up to the standards that are unrealistic and just like unhuman, as trying to fulfill their mandate as a man. So I've found that the mindful masculinity approach is generally relatable, especially where you can maybe kind of help men get out of their head a little bit and kind of into the body, where like mindfulness based stress reduction techniques often lead men and other people into that kind of somatic, like physical sensation work. I know you spoke on the podcast about sitting and being still and how that was transformative for you, which is not so much like a valued state of being in our kind of fast-paced culture. And so, a lot of times that fast-paced pressure to be productive, to perform, to provide, it keeps us up here in our logic brain and our reasonable mind a lot, where emotions I think are typically born, but they kind of move out like teenagers into the body. And so when we can kind of work through mindfulness based techniques in not ignoring our thoughts but working with them, and then also working with our emotions that show up a lot more in like our chest or our shoulders or our hands or our abdomen, our legs, our toes, our thighs, and all of those other parts of our body. Mindfulness based approaches I think are really helpful in kind of leading men from that journey from their head to their heart. And so then we can open up the heart, we can access empathy, we can access more vulnerable emotion that I think a lot of men typically avoid through that kind of stoic, logical, reasonable mind. And so that mindfulness based like masculinity stuff, I think it helps like I said, just open up awareness, body scanning. We can check in how things are going in the body, and then we can connect that to, balancing, almost like from a DBT perspective or dialectical behavior therapy perspective. We can balance both our states of mind with our reasonable logic brain and mind, and then our emotion mind as well. And we can kind of walk that middle path.
Yeah, it's such a helpful start to share the understanding of how you came to know about this concept of the man box. I mean, it's a simple fact, but someone created content for men, and that's why you found that. And it's just really cool. Now we're here also creating content for men, referencing that. And it seems like every man falls into the man box to some degree. A lot of the example you gave were obviously more distinct and, let's say, tend to be outliers, hopefully, as far as the more prominent expressions of that staying in the man box. But I do think that we're all there to a certain degree. And I imagine when men come to you, a lot of them are there. So I'm curious, when you find a guy that comes to you for therapy, what are the main problems and pains that get them to start working with you? And how do you see those struggles typically manifest before a man decides to seek help?
Well, of course, my specialty areas are working mostly with early fatherhood and new dads, and even grieving fathers, or just a variety of men who are in their fatherhood journey in different stages or phases and parenting journeys. So, what I see most often, maybe I'll just kind of think of a couple different ways that men show up. There's generally, I think you can split people into two categories, whether they're internally motivated or externally motivated. And sometimes it's a combination of the both. That kind of like outside pressure might be a spouse or a partner saying like, hey, like I've reached my limit, or I think you maybe should talk to somebody. I really love you. I'm concerned about how you're handling things, or how you're impulsive and maybe kind of flying off the handle with anger, or maybe you're a bit lonely and need someone to connect with. I've definitely come across many men who had zero confidence from the very beginning that therapy was something that could benefit them, and they were not always, but sometimes just kind of going through the motions and reaching out just to appease their partner maybe. I think it's more often though that it's some kind of combination where they've got some outside pressure, some outside motivating factor, but also that internal motivation where maybe whatever plan they had before for dealing with stress or managing mood or anxiety disorder symptoms, or just general emotional life, relational life, whatever plan they had, it wasn't really working out. And so it kind of seemed like they needed a new plan. Maybe they've exhausted their self-help options, or just like found like they were hitting a roadblock, or kind of spinning the hamster wheel, like kind of finding themselves in the same outcome situations. So, I think maybe sometimes people don't really know how to process trauma, for example, or haven't really given any attention to trauma, and like it's in, past trauma and how it impacts like current functioning or like their current life. And so I think whether it's big T trauma or small T trauma, like trauma is trauma. But I take the view that just general manhood can be traumatic, and general life in general can be quite cruel. And it doesn't have to mean that someone had some big, terrible, awful trauma. But I think just even from a young age, being told not to cry as a boy can be emotionally, socially damaging. And so, a lot of men grow up in a household where they had a parent who was angry and loud, felt like they had to be loud in order to be heard, to keep the peace and the order in the home. And so now a lot of men who are becoming fathers, they're kind of at that inflection point of becoming a dad, raising a child, but maybe reflecting on their own childhood and what life was like for them growing up and how they were raised, and really trying to navigate and sort out, the everyday, like nitty gritty moments of their life and how they show up. And a lot of times maybe they've lost their temper, or they've, thrown the stone, but they can't get it back, like they've caused some damage, and they might find themselves later in the evening kind of like just swirling in some remorseful like regret, which I think is like some healthy guilt, or like appropriate guilt, and like some healthy shame to have. And I try to tap into that with men. And I think there's a lot of inappropriate guilt and a lot of like toxic shame that we experience growing up. Shame can be a, dare I say, like manipulative tool in trying to achieve like discipline and obedience in young men and boys and girls, of course. But I think, we maybe have experienced those kind of like maybe father wounds or mother wounds or family wounds growing up. And then now, as men are aging and getting older and stepping into that like transition, that big, huge transformational role shift and change into fatherhood and becoming a parent, which of course mothers and women experience as well in matrescence, but like that kind of putrescence, that shift into fatherhood and that paternal role and identity, like it's kind of like I said, that inflection point where a lot of men are looking for a new roadmap. They're looking for a better way or a different way in managing their stress, managing their relationships, and navigating some of these like tricky, slippery slopes where it's really easy to fall into some old habits and fall into some old patterns that can be so ingrained over time throughout life and really difficult and challenging to break or change on their own. And so they might recognize me as a male therapist, maybe someone that they can feel a bit more comfortable opening up to, and talking about their internal world and their private life and personal lives. And I certainly try to join people as that partner, like joining them through the truth and finding ways to make sure that they're not feeling re-traumatized, shamed, or blamed, and just trying to make sense of it with people, and just trying to understand what's happened, where they've been, where they're at now, and obviously what direction they'd like to go. And so, I try to early on get a vision for what that looks like. And, one question I often ask folks is like 20 years from now, like let's keep one foot here in the present, but let's put one foot 20 years down the road, and just try to imagine, if I had a chance to ask your adult child, what was your childhood like, and how they would describe their childhood and the role that you played in it as their father, like what would you love to hear? What would you prefer them to say? And I hear a lot of men say, well, like I'd like to have my child say that I was there for them, that I supported them, that, I guided them with good advice or life lessons, and help them learn how to cope with stress, with growing up, with living a life in a cruel world. And I say, okay, well, like, like let's dial it back. Like that's a great vision, but how are we living now in the present moment? And does that fit, right? Like, are we aligned with those values of what's important 20 years from now? And, where's the discrepancy? Or maybe let's take a look at some barriers and what might get in the way of that. And let's try to be mindful of that. And how can we address those barriers? And maybe let's outline a list of strengths, like what kind of things might support and contribute to that vision. Okay, let's dial it back a little bit further. Let's focus here and now and the immediate next steps. And how can we maybe take some of these complaints, maybe by your wife or your spouse or your family members, or the complaints that you have about yourself, and how can we make some tiny twists? And it's not like we have to change everything, but like if we need to create that new roadmap, like that's kind of how I get started with a lot of folks.
Yeah, I appreciate that framework for a few reasons. I think one, it reminds me of this quote that women are initiated by biology through the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, typically, obviously, not for every woman as far as the latter goes, but the men are initiated through culture. but we don't have this culture of initiation. And a lot of men are seeking what you used. I like the phrase roadmaps. In a sense, many women tend to be a little bit more ready to be mothers and tend to step into that role a little more naturally. We're both fathers. I at least can speak for myself. I found it was difficult to know how to prepare to be one because I'm not as biologically connected to my kid and not as in tune with that process. And in that, also, how do I support my wife who is in tune with that? And I often was had moments of looking for that roadmap of what does it look like to support her, to for me to know how I express my role as a father. And then obviously once he was born, it's a free for all for everyone. As the famous saying goes, there's no guidebook, but nonetheless, we still need the guidance. And I appreciate that you named that it always is tends to be these external and internal factors, which I think is a generational shift. I think previously, unless you had something really bad happen in your life, you probably wouldn't come to therapy. But now we're moving into more of a proactivity where I am finding, and to a lot of men's credit, yes, people in their lives are bringing up that they have issues, but I don't sense that they're necessarily being dragged there. There is a deep sense to want to do it right. And I think that's a common misconception of culture on a lot of men is I think there's this assumption that many men don't want to change and don't want help. I think deep down they struggle to ask for help, certainly. But I'm curious when a guy comes and is looking for that roadmap, do you find, you mentioned DBT, do you find that you use set frameworks that you have found that tend to be helpful in fulfilling that roadmap? Or does it depend on the guy and then you, through, psychodynamics, kind of change the approach based on their needs? Or, yeah, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I always work with the person in front of me, and I've got some extensive training in a few different particular models and areas of my work and approach to treatment. So one that I'm particularly excited about, I'll speak maybe briefly about. I just recently completed the training for it last month in April, and it's called Accelerated Resolution Therapy, which is a trauma-informed approach to care. It was kind of born out of the EMDR, or eye movement desensitization reprocessing approach to treatment. So the founder had been training in EMDR and just found that maybe their way of working wasn't accepted by the EMDR trainers and community. And they had pretty much been told, like, well, you can't call it EMDR because what you're doing is not EMDR. So maybe you should call it something else and maybe start your own therapy. So they did. And they thought it worked a little bit better. So it's called accelerated resolution therapy. It does borrow and take some concepts from EMDR, but it's got a lot to do with bilateral stimulation and using eye movements. But the research and the evidence base is clear as an emerging treatment over the past 10 to 15 years that rapid recovery from trauma and other mental health problems can be achieved within 1 to 5 sessions. And it's in my view, like when I was going through the training, like the way that I had kind of conceptualized it for myself, I was like, wow, like this is almost like psychological, like non-invasive, like neurosurgery, which is intense, right? Like speaking that out loud and just kind of thinking of an approach to treatment, mental health treatment in that way, it's wild to me. But it what it does is it helps show the brain images and pictures of distressing traumatic memories. And no matter what kind of approach to treatment, like part of my goal as a trauma informed therapist is to take traumatic memories and to transform them into ordinary memories. In a sense, trying to like take the sting or the emotional physical sensation sting out of remembering some bad things that happened to us, so that way that past trauma, the traumatic events, we can't change what happened in the past, but in that moment in time, there was something that happened to our bodies, to our minds, to our brains. And so that has carried with somebody throughout their life since that traumatic event. And so accelerated resolution therapy, what it does is it helps, like I said, show the brain the problems, those problem images and pictures, and in a very particular, like scripted protocol. And from then on, like that first time we show the brain those pictures and images, that's the most challenging part of the treatment session. And then from there, it gets a little bit easier. It gets a little bit more pleasant. And we work on making tiny twists to positivize, or like positivization, like trying to create image replacements that are a bit more positive, a bit more comforting, or a bit more safe and soothing. So the whole mantra for ART, or accelerated resolution, is that you keep the knowledge you keep the knowledge or the facts of what happened. It's not like you forget what happened, but you lose the pain. And in that training, I had provided treatment and then also received the treatment. And me personally, like using my own life story as a part of the role play for the treatment, I definitely noticed a positive impact in how I reprogrammed my brain and how I was able to store those memories in a different positive way. And I think especially for men, it's a really helpful roadmap in treatment because it requires very minimal talking. You don't have to talk about traumatic events. You don't have to go through a whole like narrative talking about what's happened to you in your life or how you feel about it. I'm really excited to offer that. So that's something new in my practice. But I very much connect a lot of men to DBT and dialectical behavior therapy. I think there's a lot of practical tools in the four components of DBT treatment, like mindfulness based tools, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness tools. Acceptance and commitment therapy is a big one that I like to work with, which also includes, as like one of those third wave therapies, it includes a lot of mindfulness based theories and approaches to, especially like the tool called like cognitive diffusion, trying to diffuse the power of thoughts and trying to make contact with the present moment. Really, like the goal of ACT is trying to enhance and increase psychological flexibility, which if you connect back to the man box, that restriction in how men are supposed to think and feel and act, it's kind of opening them up to maybe something a bit more healthy, and values based and aligned with what's important to them, which I think about like the trajectory and the lifespan of men, and especially looking and thinking about grandfathers, and as you existentially march in lockstep towards the end of your life, you're looking back often like at the beginning, and maybe you're sitting with regret, and maybe that softens some of the guarded armor, and you're kind of, as it maybe in your 50s 60s, like becoming that teddy bear grandpa that spoils their grandchildren and doesn't want anything to do but to retire and help their grandchildren play and find joy and stuff like that. So I think it would do younger generation men a big favor, especially like kind of breaking some of those generational harms and patterns, to add more psychological flexibility. And we can do that with acceptance and commitment therapy. Yeah, I'll let you jump in. I could go on, but those are kind of three things that I tend to focus on, three approaches to treatment. But I just certainly want to check in to see if anything comes up for you. Make more dialogue, conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning those. I am also a fan of DBT and ACT, and I use those. And I appreciate how you mention with ACT that implementation of values. I think that's something a lot of men resonate with in a healthy, challenging way, which is okay, you say you care about this, right? But if we look at where you're experiencing the most friction or conflicts or issues in your life, it seems like you're not expressing that value, and that cognitive fusion comes into play where many of us have this idea that we are doing better than we think, which is a natural human condition, give ourselves more credit. But it's important to call it out in a way, and you mentioned this earlier, where it doesn't lead to the toxic shame, but that there is a place for shame and guilt to help you see the pains of what isn't right and give you an opportunity to change it. So that's the first thing. The second, this new therapy you mentioned sounds really promising, very exciting. I'm certainly going to check it out, and we'll make sure to put it in the show notes for people to understand it more. What came to mind for me was that many guys that come to me to work with, they understand that their father was not the best example. They have these traumatic memories either directly from him or indirectly related to him. And they usually can separate, like, okay, I know that this was how he is, and I don't want to repeat that. The issue is that they have no new image to replace it with.
Mm-hmm.
And so they say, okay, I know I don't want to do that, but in some ways, what else do I do? And where do I go from here? And how do I make sense of that? If I'm not going to become that, what do I do with it? And it seems like this therapy is really powerful, and that it goes directly to more symbolic archetypal processing, which says, what's the narrative? What's the meaning within these experiences and core memories you've had? what were the beliefs that you had from them? How can you, I like the phrase, exchange them to give you a new, better way of being a man in the world that honors that that happened to you and integrates it and includes it because it happened. You have to, but in a way where it doesn't, let's say, become the primary image in which you see manhood or fatherhood, etc. I'm curious how you've taken that form of therapy and related it in that way, and if you feel like that seems true for you as well.
I agree with you that so many of us, especially in like maybe our generation, like folks in their 20s, 30s, 40s, growing up with maybe like boomer parents who they were raised by their parents, which from yet another generation, and I think that kind of generational trauma is something that there's a lot of folks like reckoning with, and they're maybe doing things in their family or doing things in their life that they don't have that role model, or, they're doing things for the first time. Maybe that's, for example, going to college, right? Like sometimes there's a lot of first generation college students in their family where no one before them attended college. And I'd say maybe one of the troubling kind of modern statistics for men, especially, is that admission rates are down for men, and a lot more females or women are attending college, especially over the past 10 to 20 years, 30 years, but men are maybe like, doing other things, which I certainly like support. I think there's a lot of ways, especially in trades and vocational training, that men can find their social productivity. But, in general, it could be the fact that we are learning how to role model, and especially role modeling 24/7 in ways that we've never been shown. So that expansion of masculinity, that expansion of personhood, it's definitely like a new and different and unfamiliar, like uncharted territory for a lot of folks. So I think people like you, people like me, people who are mental health professionals, other folks in helping professions and in education, I think we're taking on a very important role and responsibility in living those values and modeling and role modeling those values for vulnerable men who maybe need a bit more patience or a bit more grace or a bit more compassion and empathy and understanding, where maybe they didn't necessarily get that growing up or in community with their friends, which is from a very early young age their manhood, boyhood is precarious, and they're threatened and put into that man box. And so if they're not getting quality nurturing and leadership in their family growing up, well, we've seen from the recent like adolescence Netflix documentary that they will turn to maybe their screens and their digital communities and networks. And the manosphere is very impactful and powerful for young, impressionable, vulnerable adolescent men. And so, it is so important that we've got something like your podcast and more of it, and getting voices out into digital spaces and cultural spaces, social spaces, where we can shape the message and the narrative that I think Bell Hooks in her book The Will to Change, she speaks of how like really at our core, like men really want to love and be loved.
Yeah, that's such a powerful statement that sadly many men find weird to say out loud. And, I think it's not normalized. And I agree that a man will seek out a model for how to do something. And if there are not healthy men to model after, whether it's through that healing work of this new therapy you mentioned or direct person in their life, which again, the statistics say the chances of them having someone is in the single digits, then they will find someone online to model their life after. So I agree with that. And I think in a industry like ours, where 70 to 80% are women, I have found just the simple fact of me being a guy has put some guys at ease and help them open up more, help them be more trusting. And I'm certainly not correlating just because you're a man, you deserve to be trusted. Trust is obviously earned. But I think on a symbolic level, there is some sort of resonance. And I have found that the bar is low. I think many men aren't looking for a superhero or someone to blow them out of the water and convincing them. I really think they're just looking for genuine guidance. And it seems like you provide that. And one thing you also incorporate in your work, I'm curious to hear about, is somatic therapy. There's been an increasing amount of attention to this in being a type of treatment in general and specifically within therapy. And you emphasize this mindfulness masculinity. And I just want to give you a shout out. A few minutes ago, I saw you pause, take a deep breath, close your eyes before you answered. I think that was such a beautiful, subtle embodiment of just how to do this. But I'm curious if you could explain how men become less embodied as they develop and how reconnecting with the body can transform their emotional lives. I know you are familiar with Liz Plank's work in the For the Love of Men, so I'd love to hear about that and how that transforms your approach.
I love Liz Plank and all that she does in her work. She's a French Canadian journalist and media personality, and she wrote a book called For the Love of Men, a new vision for mindful masculinity. And I read through that book. I want to say it was like 2018, 2019, not long after it was released. What struck me and one of my biggest highlights and takeaways is from that book was like kind of feminist movements over the years. Obviously, maybe there was a lot of like learned hatred towards men from many women and like resentment that built up over the years, and understandably so for how many women have been treated with the pervasive misogyny and cross cultures. So what I found as a highlight from that book was that like feminist movements had been maybe kind of missing the mark over the years, and instead of like man bashing, they needed to call men in instead of calling men out. And that's where like even that book, I think when she had it published, I think the original subtitle had the word toxic masculinity, to move from a toxic to a more mindful masculinity. And she actually removed that and then republished with the new subtitle, A New Vision for Mindful Masculinity. And I think that's so important because that somatic work, I'll speak to that maybe a little bit in this mindfulness sense, and how men might be kind of tuned out or turned off from conversations around something like patriarchy, which often happens if you look at like, a lens or a context of race, where many white folks and white identifying folks are tuned out because, maybe they themselves did not start slavery, for example. So they look and say like, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. So why should I, take responsibility for white supremacy, or why should I care or do any kind of work around white privilege? And the thing is, it's like, well, you have this visible privilege that means something to you, but it means something completely different to someone else who's been impacted by other folks and maybe including you because of that privilege. And so, yeah, definitely like I carry some visible forms of privilege that, show up whether I care or not, or whether I've done the work or not. Calling men in instead of calling them out, calling white folks in instead of calling them out, there's something special that can happen from that. But if we're just calling men out, or if we're just calling white people out, there's a defensiveness that often takes shape. That guarded armor kicks in, and so people are then more quickly to move into denial. And so a somatic form and trauma-informed approach to treatment that I like to work with, one that I didn't mention yet, is called AEDP, or Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Psychotherapy. And it uses this coping tool or coping resource called the change triangle. And so it's an inverted triangle. Top left is defenses, top right is inhibitory emotions, the bottom point is core emotions, and underneath it's that authentic, open-hearted state. And so I take this from a book and an author. The book is called It's Not Always Depression, a new theory for reconnecting, or for listening to your body, discovering core emotions, and reconnecting with your authentic self. And so the author's name is Hilary Jacobs Hendel, and she found in her practice many folks would show up after years of maybe depressive symptoms and CBT treatment and medication therapy with antidepressants. Maybe their depressive symptoms remained about the same, or over time maybe sometimes even got worse. So she introduced them to this somatic form of treatment, AEDP, and she introduced them to her change triangle coping resource. It's like a visual tool, but she gives that change triangle and offers mindfulness with a map. And so it's telling you what to do at each point of the triangle. So if you find yourself in defense, or if you find yourself in inhibitory emotions like anxiety, guilt, or shame, or if you find yourself in the core emotions like anger, sadness, fear, disgust, joy, excitement, sexual excitement, well, really what you want to be is down here underneath those core emotions in that authentic, open-hearted state. But a lot of times we can't get there because maybe something terrible, awful, bad, traumatic happened to us. And in that event in our life, we felt intense. Maybe, like, we'll give the example if someone lost a loved one, maybe someone passed away. And Hillary Jacobs Hendel, when she launched this book, she had been writing in the New York Times, and she wrote an article about grief and loss and shame and guilt, and how all of these things were wrapped up in the defense of depression. And so if someone lost someone, maybe that's intense sadness, right? So anytime they're reminded of that loved one being lost, their grief, their form of grief taking the shape of sadness is so big and so overwhelming. So they're down here to start at the bottom point of the triangle. But the thing is that inhibitory emotion is tangled up and wrapped up almost like a neuron that fired together and wired together in our brain. So maybe that anxiety is wrapped up with that intense sadness. So anytime that we're reminded of that loved one that was lost, well, we start to feel that sadness and it starts bubbling up. It's getting bigger. And so that anxiety, because it's wrapped up, it kicks in and it tells our brain that it's not safe. Don't go there. Don't talk about it. Don't look at it. Avoid it. And that anxiety is really big and overwhelming too. And we don't like that. So we flip over to the other side, to the defense top left point. Defenses can be anything we do to avoid emotion. And so in my work with men, I take this perspective and I share how, like, emotions are neither good nor bad. They just are. And emotions are really poor masters. So if we follow and listen to them and do as they say, then we're going to hang out in defense. We're not going to get to the core emotion. So that depression persists. And I say emotions are really poor masters, but really good messengers. So what that tells us is, like, you feel sadness because you feel love. You loved that person. It was so meaningful. And of course, it's sad that they're no longer with us or that they've passed. And so we find ways to put that defense to the side. Maybe understanding it can just be enough, knowing when to recognize and look out for it. Then we can do things to calm and relax our anxiety. We can transform shame and guilt. We can turn toxic shame into a healthy shame, or just kind of put it to the side if it's not healthy. We can transform inappropriate guilt to appropriate guilt, or just put it to the side if it's not healthy. We can move past our defenses. We can calm anxiety, transform shame and guilt, these emotions that inhibit us from accessing our core emotions. And if we can untangle, almost like creating new neural pathways in our brain, much of which is made possible by slowing down, getting out of our brain, out of our defenses where they show up, getting into the body, doing that somatic work, deep belly breathing, kind of like bringing the oxygen in our nose, out our mouth, right? Our body brings in oxygen, gives it to our lungs, gets into our blood, pops up to our brain, and now our brain has oxygen. We can think more clearly, which means we can start to access clarity, or any of the other 7 or 8 C's in that open-hearted, authentic state. So if we can actually slow down, listen to our body, calm it all down to a more clear, calm, connected state, we can then tap into our courage, our curiosity, our creativity. We can reconnect with our authentic self. We can step into the shoes of the person that Carl Jung would say, become who you are. I think maybe you mentioned that in an earlier podcast, but we oftentimes, like I said, get wrapped up into that defense because of those inhibitory emotions, because they're tangled up with our core emotions, and because the man box says, don't go there. A lot of men, they feel that sadness. And you think about maybe someone like Tony Soprano, who, like, whenever someone passed away, he's like, what are you going to do? Forget about it, like, sad. Yeah, but what am I going to do? Like, cry? Crying, neither masculine nor feminine. It's just human release of energy. And, it actually, like, if we can get some tears out every now and then, like, I often ask, people just in general, like, what would your tears say if they had a voice? And they say, well, that felt good. It felt good to release. And what that does for us, like, neurochemically and biologically, is that, it releases our cortisol levels, like our stress levels can come down. So there's this neuroscience of emotions and this psychology of men, like education, that I bring into this somatic work and this mindfulness based approaches, whether it's with DBT, ACT, AEDP, or ART, like all these alphabet soups. Um, you know, a lot of times it might take me a while to get there, especially when someone's showing up in my therapeutic office saying, like I'm here because someone told me to be here and I don't really believe in therapy and I'm this like traditional man, like how are you going to help me? What can you offer? And so I have to adopt the pace of nature in my own self. I have to take my own breath and I have to regulate, and then I can co-regulate, and then I can bring them into that like mindful, like I said, journey from your head to your heart, and work on these tiny twists and work on expanding, redefining masculinity, and helping them like create something that works for them.
Yeah. I appreciate you mentioning AEDP. I'm also a big fan, so it sounds like we're twins in the sense of how we administer therapy. But shout out because I think she's from New York and we both lived there as well. So it must be a Big Apple thing. But, I appreciate you mentioning that in conjunction with the somatic therapy, because I think many men or people misconstrue somatic therapy almost as the end of all ends. And really, it is the primer or the gateway, the thing to then lead you into the awareness in your language as what's going on, that always has to start with the body. It puts a necessary first step back in place to say, okay, as much as you want to conceptually and rationally get this, you have to start here to be in tune. And then from that place and that level of intelligence opens up the understanding to then use the triangle framework, which we'll definitely put all that in the show notes as well. And many of us men are not in tune with our bodies, and we only resonate with the core emotion of anger, which we also like to call frustration or
We know
impatience or
that,
these
right?
things. Say that again.
I said, we know that. We know anger.
Yes,
We most
exactly.
commonly express it as like, I'm frustrated, right? I think it was Bill Burr, the comedian. He's like, men are either fine or you're mad. And if you're not fine, well, you're probably mad, and that's it. That's all men are allowed to be, he says.
100%. It's just this very limited understanding falling within the man box of what you can express. So, on that, I would be curious to hear, you work extensively with men who struggle with alexithymia, which is the difficulty in identifying and expressing emotions. Could you talk about how this emotional stoicism or anger impacts men, particularly in intimate relationships and couples therapy? I'm especially interested in your perspective on how it affects dynamics like sexual intimacy.
I have to give credit to my membership in the American Psychological Association's Division 51. That's their membership division for the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. And there's a past APA and APA Division 51 president named Dr. Ronald Levant. And he's written several books on men and masculinities, but particularly I've been able to take away a lot from my membership in that group and learn a bit about alexithymia and how to assess and treat men who have that kind of really strong stoic muscle and training, and they maybe lack the range of emotional expression and the will to change. So, in general, what I often see, for example, in my role as a couples therapist or even working individually, and men come in, like they often complain about, or couples complain about, like a breakdown in communication. Their therapeutic goal is to improve their communication, right? And so I've worked with some men who maybe their partners describe them as like an autistic robot. Like, where's your emotion? Like, you just shut down. You just start stonewalling. And, a lot of men may take the position, they argue that they're trying to control the damage. They don't want to say anything that makes things worse. Right. So they'll kind of pull back and withdraw. But the problem then becomes that it's this badger that has having this like anxious attachment style keeps clawing at the turtle who goes into their shell to retreat, to withdraw. Their avoidant attachment style is just kind of making the couple go round and round in this criticize and defend, or criticize and withdraw, this pursue and distancer dynamic. So in working with couples, I pull from the Gottman method and emotionally focused therapy and relational life therapy approaches, working with men and trying to see that, like I've said from the beginning, like whatever plan they had before, it wasn't working out. So we need a new plan. Let's turn towards instead of turning away. right? Let's give permission for emotions, and let's maybe part of my work has to directly address the anxious pursuer. Maybe that's the female partner or the wife, and we have to have them help me create more of a safe, non-blaming, non-judging, non-shaming therapeutic connection and triangle with the male partner, who maybe they've expressed their emotions, and maybe the female partner sees that as like an indictment of female failure. Like if my man's got pain or hurt, maybe that means I'm not good enough. And so, there's a lot of work going on between the partners, but especially like, the man's complaint or the male partner's complaint is often like a lack of physical intimacy, and they just maybe want to have more sex. Maybe they see that as like an indicator of the health and wellness of their relationship, which by all means, okay, but there's other ways that we can also qualify or quantify health and wellness or quality of a relationship. And for many female partners, that is the emotional connection and the emotional capacity for partners to open up and be vulnerable with each other. And so I see that complaint about communication problems and that goal towards improved communication often like listening with a third ear, as though there's been a breakdown in emotional intimacy and emotional connection. So I'll quite frankly tell people, like, maybe it's time to take the dick off of the table, or maybe that's a crass way of saying it, but I think a lot of men hearing that can connect and say, well, I need to focus more on emotional intimacy and building that emotional safety, whether that's internally or externally in the space between me and my partner, before I even try to pursue some kind of physical sexual excitement and connection. Because a lot of times a female partner, they may not be in the mood when they're not feeling seen and heard and understood emotionally to engage in more sexual romantic relations and experiences with their partner. Maybe they've built up that resentment for being criticized or tuned out and shut out when they were feeling vulnerable as a badger needing help, clawing, pursuing, asking for some kind of like emotional connection, emotional respect. And so, a lot of times we might be able to indirectly get both partners what we want when we almost kind of tell them what they're asking for right away. It just kind of has to take a back seat. We have to slow down, and we have to like really find that authentic self, get into that open-hearted state, both partners, and really start to have more love conversations where we can listen with an open heart, open mind. We can validate each other, and we can express what we have to say simply, softly, slowly. We can use an RLT feedback wheel where we can provide feedback in a 4-step process where we can say what we saw, what we heard, as if it was on a video recording. We can describe, the story that we made up in our mind and what happened. We can directly express how that made us feel, and then we can make the ask or the request and deliver the feedback to get our needs met or what we need to happen the next time. RLT feedback wheel is a great like 4-step process, just kind of allowing someone to give feedback in a way it can be well received, clear, non-blaming, non-shaming, not critical. So we avoid and break that criticize defend dynamic. We can blame the cycle and not the partner. And then we can move into like some Gottman method, like State of the Union meetings to kind of keep the accountability moving forward. And maybe once a week or once a month, twice a month, have a check-in where 5, 10, 15 minutes, short and sweet, we say, here's my source of gratitude. Here's what's going well. Here's a regrettable incident. Here's what I didn't like, or here's what hurt me, and then, talk about like moving forward. What do I need from you? How can we be a team and not work against each other, but get more of us and less you versus me?
Now, all those are such helpful frameworks, and I appreciate you mentioning them. And the great thing about them is they could be used individually or in collaboration, with each other. And I've heard it said that women are like ovens, men are like microwaves, and it takes time for a woman to warm up. And I think those needs for emotional connection are so important. And it may be worth having another conversation about how men can regulate their sexual energy, because I think a lot of times the assumption is, well, it's just there. I need to get it out, and they can become demanding and needy with it. But the reality is, what you're saying is you have to prioritize the right type of connection, or let's say the connection that will have the most positive impact on your relationship. And while you may perceive that that's sex, oftentimes it's the emotional that's going to have the more sustainable connection without ignoring the need for the sexual as well. So much good things. Curious where people can find you.
So my website is the name of my practice. It's Verve Psychotherapy, V as in Victor. And so it's www.vervepsychotherapy.com. I'm on Instagram with the same name or handle. And one thing I maybe speak about is I'm really excited to offer a new workshop. It's a mental fitness workshop for expecting fathers in their third trimester. And it's an in-person support series. It's going to be located in Westfield, New Jersey. It's actually in partnership with a local pediatrician named Dr. Blair Rolnick, who's helped me develop and review the curriculum. So they'll be hosting in their space, and I'll be facilitating. It's a workshop called Becoming Dad. So I'm super pumped and excited to bring that to Westfield, New Jersey. But otherwise, I've got some plans to launch some online or virtual groups. I can be connecting with clients in 5 states where I'm licensed in either New Jersey, New York, or Connecticut, or Maryland and Georgia. And, I have my online private practice working with clients in all 5 states for individual therapy or couples therapy, primarily new dads or grieving fathers in early fatherhood and postpartum couples.
Oh, well, very excited you have so much going on and so many different types of offerings, which again, we'll make sure to put in the show notes, and excited about this workshop in New Jersey. Selfishly, I do hope it's recorded one day or offered online, as I think it's going to be a very key offering that many of us dads don't have. So, Matthew, thank you for your generous time today and just giving us so much wisdom and insight, and really hope to do it again.
Thank you so much for having me here with you, Wes. I've really appreciated your podcast. I think it's a needed resource, and I hope it finds the right audience. And really proud to contribute in any ways I can, and can't wait to stay connected and chat more the next time.
Yes, for the sake of men. Until next time, guys. Bye.